You're overthinking this, Eli. Those dates are just suggestions. My name's Eli Vargas. I'm 41 years old, been running warehouse operations in Des Moines for 15 years. When you've spent that long in food distribution, you learn that expiration dates aren't suggestions. They're the difference between keeping your license and losing everything. Brent Langley had been our new general manager at Riverbrook Provisions for 3 months. Young guy, maybe 35, came in talking about efficiency and profit margins. The kind of manager who looked at safety protocols like they were obstacles instead of necessities. He'd walk the floor in his pressed khakis and golf shirts, pointing at perfectly good procedures and asking why we couldn't streamline them. I'd been watching him make changes, small ones at first, manual overrides on the inventory system that bypassed automatic date checks, shipping schedules that pushed product out faster than our normal rotation allowed, priority tags on pallets that should have been flagged for disposal. The warehouse felt different under his management. My crew started asking questions I couldn't answer. Why were we moving product that had been sitting in cold storage past its recommended shelf life? Why were inspection logs being completed before the actual inspections happened? Why did Brent keep telling us to focus on volume instead of compliance? I'd built my reputation on running a clean operation, 15 years without a single FDA citation. 0 recalls traced back to my warehouse. My supervisors knew the rules because I made sure they understood why those rules existed. Food safety isn't about bureaucracy. It's about the families who trust that what they're buying won't make them sick. But Brent seemed to think experience made me rigid. He'd started assigning me to different shifts, moving me away from the loading docks where outgoing shipments were processed. He wanted me focused on administrative duties, while he handled the floor operations directly. That should have been my first real warning. When a new manager starts cutting the most experienced supervisor out of daily operations, it usually means they're planning something that experience would object to. 3 weeks into this new arrangement, I started noticing discrepancies in our shipping manifests, products with batch numbers that didn't match our receiving logs, pallets marked for regional grocery chains that contained items I knew had been flagged for disposal the week before. I kept my observations to myself, but I started taking notes. Dates, times, batch numbers. The kind of documentation that becomes important when someone asks what you knew and when you knew it. Last Tuesday, I came in early to catch up on inventory reports. The warehouse was supposed to be empty except for the overnight security guard, but I heard voices coming from the cold storage section. Brent's voice, along with someone I didn't recognize. I should have announced myself, should have walked over and asked if they needed help. Instead, I stayed quiet and listened. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is pay attention when people think nobody's watching. I'd started working for Riverbrook Provisions when I was 26, fresh out of the military with logistics training and a need for steady work. My dad had spent 30 years in manufacturing before a plant closure forced him into early retirement. Watching him scramble to find new work in his 50s taught me the value of building expertise that couldn't be easily replaced. Food distribution suited me. The work required attention to detail, respect for safety protocols, and an understanding that shortcuts could have serious consequences. I liked the responsibility. When you're managing the cold chain for products headed to grocery stores across 3 states, you're not just moving boxes. You're protecting public health. My wife Claire used to joke that I was more careful with expiration dates at home than most people were at work. She wasn't wrong. When you've seen what happens when temperature controls fail or contaminated products slip through quality checks, you develop habits that follow you everywhere. Our daughter Jessica was in her 2nd year at Iowa State, studying supply chain management. She'd grown up hearing me talk about inventory systems and compliance requirements. Last Christmas, she told me she wanted to work in food safety because of the stories I'd shared about why the work mattered. That pride I felt in my profession started feeling complicated under Brent's management. The changes he implemented weren't technically violations. They were adjustments to established procedures justified by efficiency metrics and cost reduction targets. But they created gaps in our oversight processes that made me uncomfortable. I'd tried raising concerns through proper channels, submitted reports about inventory discrepancies to the regional office, requested clarification about new shipping protocols that seemed to contradict FDA guidelines. My emails were acknowledged, but never answered directly. Brent started scheduling weekly meetings with me to discuss operational alignment. These sessions felt more like lectures than discussions. He'd explain how modern distribution required flexibility that older supervisors sometimes resisted, how companies that couldn't adapt to competitive pressures ended up losing contracts to more agile competitors. He never said I was the problem directly, but his message was clear. The way I'd been doing things for 15 years was holding the company back. My crew started treating me differently too, not with disrespect, but with the careful neutrality people adopt when they sense their supervisor might not be around much longer. They'd ask me questions about procedures, then check with Brent before implementing my answers. The worst part was watching good employees start cutting corners because they thought that's what management wanted. Workers who'd been meticulous about temperature logs and sanitation protocols began rushing through procedures to meet the productivity targets Brent emphasized in every team meeting. I'd built something at Riverbrook, a culture of safety and professionalism that protected both the company and the consumers who bought our products. Watching that culture erode under pressure to move product faster and ask fewer questions felt like watching someone demolish a house I'd spent years building by hand. But I stayed quiet, kept my head down, and hoped the regional office would notice what was happening before it became a crisis. What I saw in cold storage that Tuesday morning ended any hope that this situation would resolve itself quietly. Brent was standing next to a pallet of packaged deli meats, holding a label gun and a stack of fresh expiration date stickers. The man with him was someone I'd never seen before, wearing a Riverbrook uniform but no name tag. They were systematically removing the original date labels from packages and replacing them with dates that extended the shelf life by 10 days. I watched them work for maybe 3 minutes, long enough to understand this wasn't a mistake or a one-time adjustment. They had a system. Brent would scan the original label with a handheld device, then apply a new label while his partner updated something on a tablet. They were changing not just the dates, but the batch tracking information that would make it impossible to trace these products back to their original receive date. The pallet they were working on contained product I'd personally flagged for disposal 2 weeks earlier. Premium sliced turkey and ham that had been sitting in storage past its recommended date range. Product that should have been destroyed, not relabeled for shipment to grocery stores. I backed away carefully and returned to my office. Sat at my desk for maybe an hour, trying to process what I'd witnessed. Brent wasn't just cutting corners or bending regulations. He was actively falsifying safety information on products that would be sold to families across Iowa, Nebraska, and Missouri. The smart thing would have been to document what I'd seen and report it through company channels. Give Riverbrook a chance to address the situation internally before involving outside regulators. That's what the employee handbook recommended for compliance concerns. But I'd already tried internal reporting with my earlier observations. My concerns had been acknowledged and ignored. The regional office either didn't understand what was happening or didn't want to understand. I thought about my daughter Jessica, studying supply chain management because she believed the work mattered. About my dad, who'd taught me that doing your job right was more important than doing it easy. About the families who would buy those products assuming they were safe because someone like me had verified their quality. I opened my laptop and started typing a detailed report. Not for Riverbrook's regional office this time. For the Food and Drug Administration. I included everything. The inventory system overrides I'd observed. The shipping discrepancies I'd documented. The specific products I'd seen being relabeled that morning, with batch numbers and original expiration dates. I attached photos I'd taken of suspicious shipping manifests and copied security camera timestamps that would corroborate my observations. When I finished the report, I saved it to a flash drive and emailed it to the FDA's Regional Compliance Office. Then I sat back and waited for whatever was coming next. I didn't have to wait long. Brent called me into his office Thursday morning. He was sitting behind his desk with a folder open in front of him, wearing the expression of someone who'd been practicing a conversation he didn't want to have. "Eli, we need to talk about your performance lately." I sat down across from him and waited. In 15 years of warehouse management, I'd learned that when someone starts a conversation by questioning your performance, the best response is to let them explain what they think they know. "I've been getting reports that you've been asking a lot of questions about procedures that have already been established. creating confusion among the staff about priorities that management has already clarified. He slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a formal performance improvement plan dated 3 days earlier. The document outlined concerns about my resistance to operational changes and my tendency to prioritize outdated procedures over current efficiency standards. I'm going to need you to sign this acknowledgement that we've discussed these issues. Then we'll schedule weekly check-ins to make sure you're adapting to the new expectations. I read the document carefully. It was professionally written, probably reviewed by Human Resources before Brent printed it. The language was vague enough to justify almost any disciplinary action, while specific enough to create a paper trail that would support termination if I didn't comply with whatever changes he had planned. Can I ask what specific incidents prompted this review? Brent leaned back in his chair. It's not about specific incidents, Eli. It's about attitude. You've been here a long time, and sometimes experience can make people resistant to necessary changes. I need supervisors who can embrace new approaches instead of questioning every decision. What new approaches? More flexible interpretation of guidelines that might be unnecessarily restrictive. Focus on practical outcomes instead of rigid compliance with procedures that don't always make sense in real-world situations. I set the performance plan down without signing it. Are you asking me to ignore FDA regulations? I'm asking you to be practical. Those regulations were written by people who've never worked in actual distribution. They don't understand the realities of moving product efficiently while maintaining reasonable safety standards. There it was. The conversation I'd been expecting since I submitted my report to the FDA 2 days earlier. Brent wasn't trying to coach me toward better performance. He was trying to document my unwillingness to participate in the relabeling operation I'd witnessed. I'll need some time to review this. That's fine, but I'll need your signature by Monday morning. And Eli? He waited until I was standing to continue. I've been hearing that you've been asking questions about inventory that's outside your assigned areas. Going forward, I'll need you to focus on the responsibilities specifically outlined in your job description. I nodded and left his office. The message was clear. Stop looking where you're not supposed to look or find somewhere else to work. I spent the rest of that day observing the normal flow of warehouse operations, watching my crew handle incoming shipments and prepare outgoing orders with the professionalism I'd tried to instill over the years. These were good people doing important work. They deserved better than being pressured to participate in practices that could end their careers and damage their reputations. By Friday afternoon, I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to sign Brent's performance improvement plan. I wasn't going to pretend that flexible interpretation of safety regulations was acceptable, and I wasn't going to quit and leave my crew to handle whatever consequences were coming. Instead, I updated my FDA report with details about Brent's attempt to pressure me into accepting modified procedures. I documented our conversation about flexible interpretation of guidelines and attached a copy of the unsigned performance plan he'd tried to make me acknowledge. Then I forwarded everything to a contact I had at the state health department, along with a request for guidance about employee protections for reporting food safety violations. Monday morning was going to be interesting. I came in early Monday morning and found 2 FDA investigators waiting in the parking lot. They introduced themselves as Inspector Patricia Hayes and Inspector David Kellerman, both with the agency's Midwest District Office. They'd been reviewing the information I'd submitted and had some questions about specific operations at Riverbrook Provisions. We met in the break room before the day shift arrived. Inspector Hayes had printed copies of every document I'd sent, organized in folders with handwritten notes in the margins. Inspector Kellerman had a tablet where he'd pulled up our facility's inspection history and current licensing status. Can you walk us through the specific incidents you observed regarding date label modifications? I described what I'd seen in cold storage the previous Tuesday: the systematic replacement of expiration dates, the modification of batch tracking information, the specific products involved. Inspector Hayes took notes while Inspector Kellerman used his tablet to cross-reference the batch numbers I provided with federal shipping records. According to our database, the products you described were shipped to grocery stores in Des Moines, Omaha, and Kansas City. The modified dates you witnessed would have extended their shelf life beyond FDA safety guidelines. Inspector Hayes looked up from her notes. How long have you observed these practices? The relabeling was the first time I saw it directly, but I've been documenting inventory discrepancies and shipping irregularities for about 6 weeks. And you reported these concerns through company channels before contacting us? Multiple times. Regional office acknowledged my reports but never responded with specific actions or explanations. Inspector Kellerman showed me his tablet screen. We've been monitoring some unusual patterns in recall requests from retailers who receive shipments from this facility. Products that tested positive for bacterial contamination but had expiration dates that didn't match the contamination timeline. That was information I hadn't known. Products that had already left our warehouse were failing safety tests at their destination points. The relabeling operation wasn't just a potential problem. It was an active public health issue that had already been detected by downstream quality control. How many products are we talking about? Inspector Hayes consulted her folder. Based on shipping records and retail testing reports, approximately 47,000 individual packages across 3 states. Products that should have been disposed of here instead of shipped with modified date labels. The scale was bigger than I'd realized. What I'd witnessed in cold storage wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic practice that had been going on for weeks, possibly months. There's something else you should know, Inspector Kellerman said. The regional office you contacted with your initial concerns? They forwarded your reports to us 3 weeks ago. We've been building a case based on your documentation while conducting our own investigation. So Riverbrook's management hadn't ignored my reports. They'd triggered a federal investigation that was already underway when I witnessed the relabeling operation. Brent's performance improvement plan and his pressure for me to stop asking questions weren't just about controlling a difficult employee. They were attempts to silence someone who'd already provided evidence of violations to federal regulators. What happens next? Inspector Hayes closed her folder. We're executing a formal inspection this morning. Full facility review, product sampling, documentation audit. Depending on what we find, this could result in voluntary recall, mandatory recall, or facility closure pending investigation. And my employment situation? Federal law prohibits retaliation against employees who report safety violations. If your employer takes adverse action based on your cooperation with this investigation, that becomes a separate violation with its own penalties. I nodded and checked the time. 7:30 a.m. First shift would be arriving in 30 minutes, including Brent. Should I continue working normally? Inspector Kellerman smiled. Actually, we'd like you to be present during our facility inspection. As the supervisor who originally identified these issues, your expertise will help us understand what we're seeing. It was going to be a very different kind of Monday. Brent arrived at 8 a.m. and found federal investigators setting up equipment in the warehouse office. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession, as Inspector Hayes explained that they were conducting a comprehensive facility inspection based on reports of potential food safety violations. I'd like to speak with whoever submitted these reports, he said, looking around the room until his eyes settled on me. I have concerns about the accuracy of information you may have received. Inspector Kellerman stepped forward. Mr. Langley, this is an official FDA investigation. All communications regarding this matter will go through our office. Your cooperation is required by federal regulation. I watched Brent process this information. He'd spent 3 months trying to manage a compliance problem by controlling the people who might report it. Now he was discovering that federal investigators don't require permission from facility management to access records or interview employees. The inspection took 6 hours. Investigators sampled products from every storage area, photographed shipping documentation, and downloaded data from our inventory management system. They interviewed my crew members individually, asking specific questions about labeling procedures and shipping protocols. Around noon, Inspector Hayes asked me to accompany her to cold storage. She wanted me to identify the specific location where I'd witnessed the relabeling operation and point out any products that might still contain modified labels. We found evidence immediately. A pallet of packaged cheese products with expiration dates that had been printed on different label stock than the rest of the package information. When Inspector Hayes compared the dates with federal receiving records, the discrepancy was obvious. The modified labels extended shelf life by 12 days beyond FDA guidelines. "This is exactly what you described in your report," she said, taking photographs of individual packages. Modified dates, altered batch numbers, products that should have been disposed of instead of shipped. Brent appeared while we were documenting the evidence. He'd been following the investigators around the facility all morning, asking questions about their authority and requesting to review their findings. Now he was watching Inspector Hayes photograph products that directly corroborated my testimony. "Those labels were applied to correct a data entry error in our receiving system," he said. "Standard procedure for addressing administrative mistakes." Inspector Hayes didn't look up from her camera. "Mr. Langley will need to see documentation of this data entry error, including the original receiving records and approval for the label modification. I'll have to check with our regional office about accessing those files." "That won't be necessary. We've already obtained those records directly from your corporate system." Brent's expression shifted again. The investigators weren't just responding to my reports. They'd been conducting their own research, accessing company records through federal authority that didn't require his cooperation or approval. By 3 p.m., the inspection was complete. Inspector Kellerman gathered the facility management team in the break room to deliver preliminary findings. The language was technical and precise, but the conclusion was clear. Riverbrook Provisions had systematically violated federal food safety regulations through the modification of product dating information. "We're implementing immediate corrective measures," Inspector Hayes announced. "All products currently in inventory will be quarantined pending individual safety review. All outgoing shipments are suspended effective immediately. This facility's operating license is placed on administrative hold until full compliance is restored." Brent tried one more attempt at damage control. "I'd like to discuss a voluntary compliance plan that addresses these concerns while maintaining our operational capacity." Inspector Kellerman shook his head. The time for voluntary compliance ended when products with falsified safety information were shipped to retail locations. This is now a mandatory enforcement action. As the investigators packed their equipment, Brent pulled me aside. "You know this is going to cost a lot of people their jobs, Eli. Good people who had nothing to do with any policy decisions." I looked at him for a moment before responding. "You're right. Good people are going to lose their jobs because someone decided that cutting corners was more important than following the law." The FDA's public announcement came Wednesday morning. Riverbrook Provisions was issued a mandatory recall of all products shipped during the previous 8 weeks, affecting approximately 200,000 packages distributed across 5 states. The announcement included specific details about modified expiration dates and potential health risks from consuming products beyond their safe shelf life. Local news stations picked up the story by noon. I watched the coverage from my living room, seeing aerial footage of our warehouse with federal vehicles in the parking lot and inspectors loading boxes of evidence into government trucks. The reporter interviewed grocery store managers who described the challenge of identifying and removing Riverbrook products from their shelves. She spoke with food safety experts who explained how date modification could mask bacterial contamination that develops when products are stored beyond recommended timeframes. Brent's name appeared in the news coverage as the facility manager responsible for operations during the period when violations occurred. The story included details about employee reports of safety concerns and management attempts to suppress internal oversight. By Thursday morning, Riverbrook's corporate office had announced Brent's termination and the appointment of an interim management team to oversee compliance restoration. The company's statement emphasized their commitment to food safety and their cooperation with ongoing federal investigation. I received a call that afternoon from Margaret Torres, Riverbrook's regional director. She wanted to discuss my employment status and the company's plans for facility reopening under new management. "We value your experience and your commitment to compliance, Eli. When we're authorized to resume operations, we'd like you to consider returning as our facility compliance manager." I thanked her for the offer but explained that I'd already accepted a position with another company. Keystone Fresh Logistics had contacted me Tuesday evening with an offer to head their regional compliance division. They'd been following the news coverage and were impressed with my documentation and testimony during the FDA investigation. The irony wasn't lost on me. Keystone was one of Riverbrook's biggest competitors. My first assignment would be reviewing their procedures to ensure they maintained the safety standards that Riverbrook had abandoned. 6 weeks later, I was sitting in Keystone's corporate office in Kansas City, reviewing compliance protocols with their executive team. We were implementing new documentation requirements and audit procedures based on lessons learned from the Riverbrook investigation. My daughter Jessica called that evening to tell me she'd been accepted into an FDA internship program for next summer. Her application essay had described how witnessing her father's experience with the Riverbrook situation had reinforced her commitment to food safety as a career focus. "I'm proud of what you did, Dad. It couldn't have been easy knowing people would lose their jobs." She was right. It hadn't been easy. More than 60 employees had been laid off when Riverbrook lost their operating license. Good people who'd been following orders from management they trusted. But keeping quiet would have meant allowing contaminated products to reach more families, potentially causing illness or worse. The FDA's final report was released in September. Investigators had traced the modified labeling practices back 14 months, affecting nearly 500,000 packages during that period. 3 people had been hospitalized with food poisoning linked to Riverbrook products, though all had recovered fully. Brent was facing federal charges for falsifying safety records. His defense attorney was arguing that he'd been following cost-cutting directives from corporate management, but the evidence showed he'd initiated the labeling modifications without authorization from regional oversight. I drove past the old Riverbrook facility last week. There was a "for lease" sign in the parking lot and security fencing around the loading docks. The building looked smaller than I remembered, less important somehow. My new office at Keystone has a window that faces east toward the Iowa border. Some mornings when I'm reviewing compliance reports or training new staff, I think about the 15 years I spent building something I thought would last. Then I get back to work making sure the next place is built better.